All right. Yay. There we go. We are in. It's time to talk about things on the internet. Yay. Happy fall.
Happy autumnal equinox in the north and vernal equinox down under.
Yeah, happy change of season wherever you are at. I don't know about you, but I'm a little bit ready. I'm like, yeah, let's see a little something else.
Let's see a little something else.
Yeah.
The question is this Libran ingress? Is this about imbalance or imbalance?
Mm, 'tis the question, but we're on the perpetual pause right now.
The perpetual pause. You mean it's March 174th?
Yes, we're on the COVID schedule. And then, Mars retrograde has not had us rushing towards anything else, but the council is making their way out of retrograde. That's nice.
Yep. One at a time. Of course, as I know we will get to in a bit, they're making their way out of retrograde and into another round of complications that will define for us the next couple of years. I think we're already, getting a taste or tastes of it, but
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. All right, guys. Well, welcome to today's Eat and Greet. I'm really glad that you're here. Hopefully, you hear something in the next hour or so that makes you feel like it was worth it to take the time to come and watch. So, today we are going to jump in and do some talking about 2021, as well as the Saturn Uranus squares that happen throughout 2021 and what that does to shift for us. And Rick Levine is back at the Cyber House with us. We're always happy to have you, and your knowledge is welcomed and received here. So welcome back.
well, thank you. Was I supposed to bring some food, or do you supply the food?
Typically, I would supply the food, but at this particular moment in time, but I did bring you today my best cup, Rick. This is my seasonal cup, and it said I use it all year, but it says don't get your tinsel in a tangle.
Uh-huh.
And I just feel like it's a life quote at this point.
I like it. And when I saw it, my mind immediately went to Merlin's home in Cornwall. The Merlin's castle is Tintagel, which has all the letters of Tinsel Tangle in it. Tintagel.
Well, Merlin and I were on the level then. That's all I can say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, so we're laughing and we're giggling that it is somebody loved your comment about March 174th because it's true. Not fast paced. We are certainly not fast paced right now.
Well, the real question is when you have a dam built on a powerful river, let's say the Hoover Dam or some large dam. The question is the water behind the dam stagnant, or is it just building its power to be released in a manner that actually can accomplish something?
Yeah. That's what I feel like is a lot of what's happening, or is the question right now. And especially, I was thinking, I'm the lunar guide over at Astrology Hub, where we share some space. And so we'll be coming up on this Aries full moon. And I was thinking about that and the difference right now between coming to that moon with assertion instead of aggression. And that it can just be useful if we're assertive in the right way, but still it's not like this forward moving trucking kind of moon. Instead it is that waiting water that's like, well, hold on, let's look for a minute, and maybe the warrior's best instinct is to replan or reposition for a minute.
Well, yeah, and in a way, I mean, what you just described and what's really with us all the way through the end of the year, because even as Mars turns direct the week after, 10 days after Election Day in the United States, the fact of the matter is that I know we're going to be talking in a little bit about the square between Saturn and Uranus in 2021 and on into 2022 for that matter. But right now we have Saturn that's being squared by Mars. And so we have this hot under the collar need to assert that feels like it's trapped behind the dam, behind Hoover Dam, because a Mars square to Saturn is actually energy that is dammed up. Mars says flow, Saturn says no. And in a way, as Saturn restrains that Martian energy, even if it was just a regular old square in any of the other 11 signs, but the fact that Saturn is in its home sign, its domicile, and Mars is in the sign it rules, its domicile, Aries, that strengthens this dilemma. And we'll come back to that word dilemma in just a moment. This strengthens that dilemma, but then you add into that mix that normally, when Mars squares Saturn, it lasts a few days. And instead, this one lasts several months because of Mars's retrograde in Aries. And so we have this perfect storm, or let's say we have this a cosmic great wall, if you will, that is preventing this cosmic storm from erupting and exploding right now. And what it's doing is it's making those people with agendas, whatever that agenda is, whether it's romantic or personal or career wise or political or economic, whatever the agenda is, and whatever side of that issue you fall on, it's basically turning your need to assert into even a more powerful need to aggress, because you can't break through the wall. And yet, if we aggress, if we hit too hard, if we, and I say hit, I don't even mean physically, I mean if we forcibly express ourselves, that's just going to strengthen the wall, and Saturn's going to come down and prevent us from getting what we want anyhow. And so it's a very, very strange time we are in, because more important than ever, we have to focus on the long haul. We have to focus on the long term. It's the idea of keeping our eyes on some distant goal. And they've said that there's an old saying that you can win every battle and still lose the war, because you're so exhausted from every battle that, okay, you win, but you can't assume the place that you were going to assume when you won the war. And in a way, we need to pick our battles very carefully. We need to conserve our energy like that water behind the dam, because we're going to need it. This isn't just about what's going on this week, this month, this year.
Yeah. And do you think, as I said, the vision I have of Saturn, even as Saturn is able to come out of that retrograde and Mars stays retrograde and they keep bonking up against each other, Saturn almost brings some wisdom to the table to say, hold on, I've seen some things. Wait a second, Mars. Just 1 second. I promise I'm going to let you go. But just 1 second, because it's very much so. I feel like it's that parent-child relationship where Mars is like, I do what I want. And Saturn's like, no, you don't. And I'm trying to actually help you. Yeah. Because we do need the long haul there.
Yeah, Jeff, my old astrology buddy and partner who passed away a number of years ago, Jeff used to say Saturn is the planet that says no but means yes, meaning that Saturn kind of helps us get to where we're going if we can learn how to restrain ourselves and improve our game. And of course, whenever he said that, because we did the stage often publicly together, whenever Jeff said Saturn's the planet that says no but means yes, I would always say, yeah, but Jeff doesn't mean on a date, just to be perfectly clear. But yeah, what you just said is that exact same thing.
Yeah, well, and Mars is just, I feel like because he's in domicile and even in retrograde, he's just a little bit of a trip right now. I mean, he's just around having these interactions left and right. And then even poor Pluto wakes up and he's like, by the way, how about that?
Well, yeah. And people forget that retrograde planets, when a planet's retrograde, it's closer to Earth than it is at any other time in its cycle. And planets are like radio stations. The closer they are to Earth in their normal cycle, the louder they are. And when a planet gets too loud, it's like it's like giving a hyperactive person Ritalin or some amphetamine derivative. So if you're hyperactive, you take a pharmaceutical that makes you even more hyperactive, and then you shut down. And that's what happens with a retrograde planet, is that it increases the energy to the point where it has a hard time expressing, which is why retrogrades can be considered negative. And because if they have a hard time expressing, then what happens is that we project the energy rather than express it. And it seems like it's happening out there. They're doing this to me. They're restraining me, Saturn retrograde. They're trying to beat me up, Mars retrograde, whatever. And so, yeah, it's more important than ever, since we have this both retrograde energy and both Mars and Saturn in their home signs, where they're theoretically the I would say the strongest, but they express the most naturally. And so you have Mars, the warrior planet, the planet that is about assertion and direction and aggression and creating, or let's say, asserting boundaries. And you have Mars, that's louder than normal, retrograde, in Aries, which is the sign of spontaneity and impulsivity. I mean, that's why it's considered to be an infantile sign. I say that as the proud owner of a Mars in Aries, a Sun in Aries, a Mercury in Aries, a Venus in Aries, and the North Node in Aries. So I get that. But they're all right now, the cardinal Aries energy, and for that matter, even the Libran energy and the Cancerian energy is all harshly aspecting Capricorn, with Saturn in its own sign in Capricorn strengthening his game, or its game, saying, you ain't going there as fast as you think you are. I am the parent. I am going to slow you down. I'm going to do this for your own good, whether it is or not, because we know that many parents do that very well, slowing, the child down to make sure that they are, internally developed enough before they go off and do X, Y, or Z. On the other hand, there are many parents who just simply are, repressive and suppressive and authoritative, whether they should be or not, over all the wrong things. And so we need to, as we go through this, make judgments about this external reality. Is this external, suppression, repression, constriction, restraint, is this valid or not? Am I going to, say yes to Saturn, meaning when Saturn says you can't do that, or this is what we're doing, are we going to become submissive to Saturn and say yes? Or are we going to draw those battle lines and stand up to the, fake authority, of, let's say, a dictatorship rather than a, democracy, for example? Not that I'm talking about anything specific here. But the question then becomes, where do we draw those lines and what do we do about them? How do we manage that energy? How do we take that, the power that is being built by the restrained energy behind Hoover Dam or the Grand Coulee Dam or whatever, and how do we release that energy, that water, on a consistent enough basis so that, that the dam doesn't break and everything floods, and so that we actually can make use of the energy that's building.
So when we're talking about that, I think that's a great question. And I see that it's coming down here too. So what do you do? What are we doing right now? What do the actions look like right now so that the dam does not get trampled?
Well, that's the $1 million question. And I don't think there is a one size fits all here. I think this is the exploration that each and every one of us needs to do. And of course, I've been using as my, kind of a byline for years now, a playoff on the think globally, act locally, which has been an environmental, consideration. And I have been saying, think cosmically, but act locally. And that is we can't change the cosmos. We can't change the world. We can't change everything all at once. But if everyone in the world began to change their own energy, then the external world would change. Jung, who's become more than a psychologist. He's very much a I don't know, like a guru figure to so many people, regardless of whether they are in therapy or have done Jungian type, what Jung called the process of individuation, whether they've done that therapy or not. So many people respect Jung, and yet what people don't realize is that the last book Jung wrote before he died, mid 50s, 56, 57, somewhere right in there, is he wrote a book called The Undiscovered Self. And in that book, he makes the claim that all the politicians and all the treaties in the world will never stop war. The way war will stop is by the salvation of the souls living within the world. In other words, that when we have cultural, national, international aggression, macho type, fist fights of which country, which ideology, is on top, so to speak, that these are the results of the suppressed anger and aggression that we have individually from our inability to handle our own local sphere of relationship energy. And so therefore, Jung makes the claim that as the individuals in the world resolve and deal with their interpersonal issues, their intra psychic issues, their internal conflicts, so that they don't have to, like a dam, so many of us unconsciously hold back parts of ourselves that we're afraid if they expressed they would cause damage in our lives, or we're simply afraid of them, and often it's a repression, we don't even know we're doing it. But as we become more aware of our own individual inner conflicts and begin to resolve them, then the external conflicts begin to ameliorate. Now, of course, the problem is that there is a large part of society, maybe even the world, that is increasing in its efforts to do that type of inner work, shadow work, depth work, spiritual work, however you want to describe it. Unfortunately, there is a significant number also of people for whom that is just not something that's important, not an issue. And I think those kinds of journeys become more of an issue when our life gets personally affected. I mean, many people who are astrologers and spiritual teachers come to that from having some sort of personal crisis, and having that personal crisis, whether it's a physical illness, it's a loss of a dear one, whether it's some sort of trauma from having boundaries messed with in one way or another. But individual crisis often sends us spiraling down and deep, and then we head off on our journey. And I think it's been said by many people that 2020 has had enough trauma associated with it that perhaps even many of those people who thought they were just fine have begun to realize, no, things are not as they seemed, and therein lies the potential for this year being a cultural, historic inflection point or turning point for humanity.
Sure, nothing like getting sent home, literal, figurative home, to have to go figure out what's going on. And then, by the way, when you come back out, we're going to change the whole outside of the world.
Yeah, yeah. Welcome to March of 2020, and here we still are, some 180 days later.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think about that though in the lens of we're here in September, almost October, and then we're going to fly forward into 2021, because I feel like it's going to come on more quickly than I think the days that are actually available. I think it's going to just kind of be here. And because we do have this sense of already being in some of those energies, as we cross that threshold and come actually into 2021 and have these energies in fixed signs ready to crystallize and fix down, and kind of, our fixed signs tend to be a little bit more stubborn. I happen to maybe be one of those. So,
Well,
you know,
and you think about it in the backdrop of all of this. We had Uranus for 7 years. Well, actually, for 14 years, it was in both a mutable water sign Pisces and then a cardinal fire sign Aries,
yeah,
where there's very little damming up the flow, where, whether it's being expressed spiritually, emotionally, through some sort of compassion, or just simply by numbing our senses. Uranus and Pisces, the energy flowed. Uranus and Aries, again, the energy flowed. In fact, the day Uranus moved into Aries was the water flowing, in the Japanese tsunami,
sure.
earthquake tsunami. That was the day that Uranus ingressed into Aries. But when Uranus moved into Taurus, although there's been a lot of talk about how Uranus is in change, Uranus, the planet of awakening and change, that this would be a 7-year period when we would deal with our food supply, because Taurus is, about basic substances like food. We would deal with the financial money, system, and that might have upheaval because of Taurus's relationship to that. We might deal with our personal basic values. All these Taurian things, that there's a list, and that's where people focused when they began to consider Uranus and Taurus. But here's the thing, as you kind of alluded to, Taurus is a fixed sign, and Uranus, the planet of sudden, unexpected change. You see, I'm convinced that Uranus, all the planets have job descriptions, and Uranus's job description is a one-liner. It says Uranus's job is the instantaneous resolution of irresolvable opposites. Another dilemma. Well, I said we'd come back to the word dilemma, and I will in a minute. But the dilemma, or the paradox, is how do you resolve unresolvable or irresolvable opposites? Because Uranus's job is the instantaneous resolution of irresolvable opposites. And the best example, I always look to nature to really understand planets. And that is that lightning, although it's often associated with Thor or with Jupiter lightning. I mean, but lightning is Uranus. Uranus is no doubt about it. Uranus is electrical in its expression, unlike Neptune, for example, which is magnetic. Magnetism has fields of influence, and where it starts and where it stops is like animal magnetism. There's this kind of like hypnotism, magnetism, dreams. Those are all Neptunian. They're kind of field oriented. Uranus, on the other hand, is electrical. It's like a spark. It's the nervous system, which is electrical. And in fact, in 1819, at the Uranus Neptune conjunction, the words electromagnetism were put together by a physicist scientist named Hans Christian Ørsted, and who's one of these people who's been immortalized because he has a unit of measure called the Ørsted. I think it measures impedance in electrical circuits. Anyhow, Ørsted discovered that electricity and magnetism were somehow interrelated, and he coined the word electromagnetism. The year that the planet of electricity, Uranus, lined up with the planet of magnetism, Neptune. Who makes this stuff up like this? Anyhow, so Uranus's job is the instantaneous resolution of irresolvable opposites. And you think of, the opposite forces in nature of electricity. We call them negative and positive, but positive isn't better than negative. In fact, negative ions are what makes us feel relaxed. You get the negative charge, the negative ionization when you have water moving against water. That's why showers feel so refreshing, or being by the ocean where water is mixing with water, or a waterfall, or a murmuring brook. All of these are negative ion generators. When you have dry air, usually cold, dry air mixing with dry air, that makes positive ions, and those are ill winds. An ill wind blows no good, is the old saying. And those winds can be the Santa Anas, they're hot and dry. The Chinooks that blow down from Canada and the United States, they're cold and dry. The Sabras, they're hot and dry. They blow across the deserts in Israel and the Mideast. The Thin, which come across and up in the Alps, and in these positive ions don't feel good. So when you have in nature positive ionization, let's just say cold, dry air, and then you have a mass of warm, wet air coming in that's negatively charged, and the negatively charged and the positively charged try to work it out as they get closer and closer. And psychologists tell us that when you have conflict, talk about it. Communication resolves conflict. And it usually does, or it can.
It can.
But sometimes communication makes the conflict worse.
Yeah.
We all have things in our lives that we just, when I'm with Aunt Mary, I will not bring up, cousin Bob because blah, 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 whatever it is. We all have issues or things in our lives that we know that if we talk about them with a particular person, there is no resolution. It'll just get worse and worse and worse. So going back to this nature metaphor, when you have when you have the warm, wet air and the cold, dry air, as they try to communicate and work it out and they brush up against each other, the tension gets greater and greater. It does not resolve, and it gets greater and greater until it's so great there is no resolution. The negative and positive charges are pulled farther and farther apart, even though they're physically closer and closer together. This is called tension, by the way. Tension is like a tug of war as opposed to compression. Compression and conjunction, tension and opposition. And when you have these energies getting closer and closer together and they can't resolve, all of a sudden, whack, and the lightning strikes.
Yeah.
And in that single moment, even though we can feel the tension building, we know the lightning is going to strike. We don't know where, we don't know when, we don't know how strong it's going to strike. We don't know what the aftermath is going to be. And that's what Uranus is like. Uranus is called the Great Awakener because when that lightning strikes for a moment, the lights go on. And then even 2 seconds or a half a second later, when the lights all go off again, we can't forget what we saw. Rick Tarnas, the author Cosmos and Psyche. Rick wrote a book on the name of the planet Uranus, which he claims was misnamed, that it really should have been named Prometheus, because Prometheus was, stole the fire from the gods. Prometheus is the bringer of invention, the bringer of divine tools into the realm of humanity. And Uranus, in a way, does that. It's that flash of lightning that we often see as the light bulb going on over your head. That light bulb that's going on is neurons firing. It's the electrical, the lightning happening that wakes us up. So Uranus is the Great Awakener. And by the way, before I stop on this little run here, I've used the word dilemma a couple of times, and I find it interesting how many words people use that without knowing what they mean. And since my real day job, I make my living as an astrologer, but my real day job is I'm a wizard. And wizards, as anyone knows who's read any of the wizarding lore, it knows that language and words are significant, that you can't make a spell, which is like either putting the letters down to make the right words or incanting those right words to have some sort of result or effect. But you can't spell unless you're calling things by their true names. And often, whether it's in Harry Potter or The Wizard of Earthsea or whatever fictional books you look at, knowing the true names of things is always a significant thing. So here's the issue with language. The word dilemma is basically what it means is two lemmas. And so when we have a dilemma like Mars square Saturn, or in 2021, 2022, we have Saturn square Uranus, this is a dilemma, and that's two lemmas. And what a lemma is that in and people probably know what a lemma is without ever having used the word, but in a Greek proof, which many of us in high school geometry had to prove, this line is parallel to that line, or this triangle is congruent to that triangle. And then we had to make these statements. Statement one, blah, 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 blah. Therefore, statement two, blah, 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 blah. Therefore, statement three, blah, 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 blah. Therefore, it's proved. And so the statements along the way to a proof are called in Greek lemmas. And when you get to a line in your proof that goes in two different ways, that's a dilemma. And so we have dilemmas in our life all the time that are basically it's like a fork in the road where you have to go this way or that way, but you can't go one way without having the potential and the possibility of going the other, because the forks lead in very different directions. And so this the Mars retrograde in its home sign of Aries, squaring Saturn retrograde until the end of the month in its home sign of Capricorn. This is a dilemma. We can either go to Mars and get angry and red and take on Saturn and say, you shouldn't be doing this. We can question authority. That's a rebellious action. That's very typical of Mars, in Aries. Or we can just totally, fall into quietness and a state of submission and let Saturn have his way, so to speak. The thing is that the solution is keeping both lemmas alive. And that is a tough thing to do. This is, in a way, we might even call this quantum indeterminacy. I see the picture of our friend Al, behind you. That would
There
be
he is.
Albert Einstein. But that whole idea of indeterminacy, and of course, as we know, Albert Einstein really had a hard time with quantum physics, and his famous line was, "God does not play with dice," which may or may not be the case. But the point here is that we are in a dilemma, and what do we do about it? What we do about it is we try to keep both sides of the dilemma in awareness. The same thing works in an individual chart. If you have an opposition or a square, the practice is, how do you take both of those planets at either end of the opposition or on either angle of the square, and how do you prevent one of those planets from going silent? How do you just shut one down? I'm saying you shouldn't, but where is it that we unconsciously or consciously shut one down because it's uncomfortable and just go to the other? That's where the problems begin. We need to keep both sides open and then act with awareness of both sides of the equation. If everyone in the country, in the United States, where you and I are at least, but I think in the world, but if everyone in the country took time to understand why someone with an opposing point of view really had that opposing point of view, without judging it and knowing that they're wrong and you're right. Now, don't get me wrong. I have my opinions, as I'm sure you do. We have our biases, but there's something is odd if both sides of every issue, and these days it's extreme in every issue. I don't care whether it's presidential politics or medical politics, or body politics, whether we're talking about Trump, Biden, or COVID, masks or no masks, vaccines or no vaccines, whether we're talking about abortion, or right to life. It doesn't matter. I mean, and those are just a tip of environment, climate change or no climate change. I mean, one can say that, well, obviously I'm right and they're wrong. But you see, the problem is that that's what everybody is saying. It doesn't matter which side of the equation you're on. And I think herein lies a little interesting side note that gets to where we're going into 2021. And that gets back to the Uranian action of lightning striking. You see, Freud, Jung, Reich, Eric Fromm, Adler, the psychoanalytic group, what they really kind of came to the conclusion is that in talk therapy, talk is Mercury. You know,
Sure.
talk therapy is based upon sending Mercury into the underworld to rescue Persephone. And that's another whole little rabbit hole that we could go down. But the myth of Persephone is basically Jupiter couldn't rescue Persephone from Hades because the gods couldn't cross over the river Styx. Yet Mercury, the psychopomp, the Mercury's job description that we don't realize, not only was the bringer of language, but Mercury's job was to guide the souls in their journeys through to and from the underworld. He was the psychopomp. And so talk therapy uses Mercury, talk therapy, to go into the shadow, to bring things out into the open so that we can then deal with it. So we have Uranus, which is based upon sudden awakening. And we've been pushed to this place where talk therapy doesn't work. You see, talk therapy works for neuroses, but not for psychoses. You can't talk your way out of a paranoid psychotic delusion. You know, paranoid schizophrenia does not succumb to talk therapy, but neuroses does. Now, it's my contention that as a culture, we've actually literally, technically flipped out, that our nervous system, which used to be inside of us, is now outside of us as the World Wide Web, as the noosphere, to quote Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. The externalization of our nervous system out there is we have an exonervous system. Like a cancer, the crab has an exoskeleton, a hard outer shell. Our nervous system, with the computer technology, electronic technology, digital technology, social media, we've flipped out and we have an exonervous system. And our exonervous system is schizophrenic, not neurotic, because if it was neurotic, we could deal with it through talk therapy. But you put two people with opposing points of view on any of the things that I brought up already, and those are just the beginning of a laundry list. All the talking in the world is not going to make the other side be convinced, whatever the other side is. And each side knows that their reality is correct and the other side is delusional. It's like we experience something in the real world, and depending upon what it is, a group of people see it this way and another group of people see it that way. They can look at the exact identical thing, and yet this is a sign of schizophrenic behavior. So into this, we do not have the luxury anymore of using talk therapy to resolve it. The thing that will resolve it will be the thing that resolves irresolvable opposites instantaneously.
Good blast of Uranus.
Enter Uranus. Now, when we say instantaneously, remember lightning strikes in, I don't know, it's a fraction of a second. I mean, but instantaneous from an archaeological, geological view can be like one of the six or one of the previous 5 mass extinctions. That from a geological time frame, it looks like these extinction points happened here, 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 and here. And yet inside those extinction points in our natural history, those extinctions lasted thousands of years. But as we get farther and farther and farther away from anything, it looks like a point. And so right now we are in the midst, arguably, of what many geologists are calling the 6th great extinction. Species are disappearing, as fast as they have during any of the major extinctions. But the instantaneity of the change that's going on now in 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000 years might be looked at as a moment in time from, let's say, the 1900s to the mid 2000s, from the 1950s to the 2050s or whatever. It may be looked at, and that's when it happened. Boom, a point. But in the middle of it, every point as you get closer and closer to it, whether that point is a star, a solar system, a planet, an atom, when you get closer and closer and closer to it, the things that we thought were solid atoms are made up of smaller solid things. And as we look at them, they're made up of smaller and smaller. And it turns out that everything is vibratory rather than solid. That solidity, to quote Einstein again, reality is an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. So we have this instantaneous Uranian action going on right now that seems to be in slow motion, kind of. We're in the midst of that. And into that, we come to 2021, when the shift, instead of being the Uranus-Pluto square of 2015 to 2012 to 2015, when so many of the issues of the mid 60s were brought back into our, into consciousness, instead of this Capricorn cluster, council cluster, or whatever you want to call it, that this has been a very profound and powerful, still is, period of time. And yet the next cosmic message that we need to process, move through, and deal with, actually, we got first tastes of this when Saturn moved into Aquarius from, what was it, March until August, no, March, July. So when Saturn moved into Aquarius, it began to pick up, even though it was a little wide, a few degrees, it began to pick up on a square to Uranus and Taurus. Aquarius fixed sign, Taurus fixed sign, 90 degrees apart. And so we began to get this sense that there's something here happening that's not about what's been going on, but it's something that brings us into the future. And remember, coming full circle to about Uranus and Taurus, it's an earth sign. It's arguably the densest, and I don't mean stupid dense, I mean compact matter, solid dense. It is the densest sign in the zodiac. And it's like trying to get someone to change their mind in a very active moment when things are going on can be very easy, compared to trying to get a granite mountain to change its mind. And you see, Uranus in Taurus, it's like arguing with granite. And in Pisces and in Aries for the last 14 years, change just flowed, because that was the nature of Uranus in those signs. But in Taurus, Uranus don't want to change, ain't gonna, until the pressure gets so great that the changes, when they occur, will be way more noticeable than they've been in the past, because they'll be like earthquakes. And this is part of what we're already seeing in 2020, is these changes that are unlike things that we've experienced in the past, that something's different. Is it just the planets in Capricorn that's different? Well, that's part of it. Remember, there hasn't been a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn since January of 1519, which was 2 months away from the night that Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the wall of a church in Germany, that basically began the downfall of the absolute rule of the authority of Rome. That was where it began. And we think of it, oh, that was the Protestant Reformation. No, that was the Protestant Reformation. And that's where we are right now. It's not just a religious issue. It's secular. It's affecting everywhere, every aspect of culture. But we are in a Protestant Reformation, and I'm not saying I know which way any of this is going to go, because I'm firmly convinced that anyone who says they know it's going to happen doesn't.
Doesn't. I think that was very PC. Doesn't. Yes. Well, Uranus has shaken a mountain. So that is certainly, we're going to see structures get different. There's lots of questions here. I'm going to ask you these real quick before we tear in there.
Right. And before we pick up the questions, let's just get the dates on, on the record, because when when Saturn peaked into Aquarius and began to square Uranus through the beginning of this year, now it's back in Capricorn doing its remedial work with the Capricorn Council.
Yeah.
When Saturn moves into Aquarius, so will Jupiter. And in fact, Jupiter will square Uranus first, and then Saturn will come in, and Saturn actually squares Uranus in February, mid-February 2021.
On Valentine's Day, no less.
Yeah, it's actually exact on the 17th, and Valentine's Day is on the 14th, but it's close enough for horseshoes. You get points. We're gonna feel it already in January. This is not just about mid-February, but it's exact around Valentine's Day. Then on the retrograde, it makes the square again on June 14th. Okay, as long as we're doing the holiday thing in the US, that's Flag Day.
Get them all. One more. Let's get one more holiday.
And then on the third and final swing forward, that's December 23rd. We can call that the solstice if we want. It's close enough. We can also call it Christmas Eve. Yeah. I mean, it's right in the midst of all of that. But the thing, though, is that what's really interesting is that by October of 2022, Saturn, now they're moving direct. Saturn is at 18 degrees 49 minutes of Aquarius. That's how far it retrogrades back. It's at 18 degrees 49 minutes of Aquarius, and Uranus is at 18 degrees 11 minutes of Taurus. It's still retrograding. But the thing here is that they are within a half a degree of being square again, even though it's not exact. The universe doesn't care about exact, because it takes very little energy to drive a circuit that's resonant. Sure. Resonant frequencies kind of have a little bit of sloppy room in there. And that's another whole rabbit hole that we could go down sometime. It's why we don't have to do a new moon ritual at the moment of the new moon. In fact, it may not be as effective as it is, afterwards, picking up on the energy that's already beginning to hum. Sure. So even though we're talking about the Saturn-Uranus square as being 3 times in 2021, here we are also now at the end of 2022, and we're not done with it. It's still there. It's still playing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now to the questions. I didn't
now
mean
to now to the questions.
I wanted to get that on the record before we move to this part.
Okay. So one of the questions, and I'm going to kind of lump these together, you guys, but so essentially the question is, in 2021, does it look like, from your perspective, that the masses get to enjoy prosperity, or does it look like there's any real forward motion in 2021?
That's a trick question.
It kind of is.
Because forward motion may or may not be prosperity. What is prosperity to you? If prosperity means real estate or owning lots of stocks and having money in the bank, I wouldn't even bother arguing or talking about that question, because I think prosperity is a different kind of riches. It's why when you go to third world nations, you see people that compared to what we have in the United States have little or nothing, and yet these people are happy. Would you call someone who had a lot of material wealth and no happiness prosperous? or would you call the person who was truly happy and had little material wealth prosperous? So that's my first problem with that question. Um, Forward motion, yeah, unquestionably, we will see forward motion.
Well, we don't have most of our planets that could retrograde this year. Actually, all of them did. So next year we don't have that. So that in itself, I think, is a finger towards some forward motion.
Well, the only two planets that don't retrograde next year are Venus and Mars. We still have retrogrades. We still have 3 Mercury retrogrades. We still have retrogrades of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Chiron, Eris, Makemake, and every asteroid.
It's big though.
Huh?
It sure seems like when Mars and Venus do it, it sure makes the rest of the regular.
Oh yeah, no, that personalizes the energy. And the other thing is that retrograde planets typically go in and out of retrograde in their own rhythms. But when you have 3 heavyweights like Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto clustered so close together, again, we come back to that sense of instantaneous. You know, they turned retrograde and direct instantaneously as if they were one. Well, yeah, they may have been weeks apart, but they weren't like 6 or 7 months apart.
Sure.
And so we had this illusion of the power of the retrogrades hit us much harder than it normally does because we got them all at once.
And we were all at home to experience it.
Well, and that's right. We'd already been the energies had already been dammed up. Mm-hmm. You know, a dam is very much like a slow motion version of something that's in every electric appliance and circuit. It's called a capacitor. And capacitors used to be these actually physical things. And there were actually, there was a thing called a tunable capacitor that I have one back on my bookshelf that was from probably the 1920s or 30s. And it was what was inside of every radio, because a capacitor was like metal plates that were interlocking with other metal plates. And you could basically adjust how much of an interaction there was between these metal plates. And that basically tuned the frequency of the capacitor discharge. Here's how a capacitor works. You know, normally in an electrical circuit, you have alternating current going boom, 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 60 times a second. That's 60 cycles per second, 60 hertz. And then you have transformers that changed, invented by Nikola Tesla, that change that alternating frequency to hundreds, thousands, even millions of times a second. A capacitor is a piece in the circuit which used to be large and physical. Now it's in chips. It's now tiny. A capacitor, basically, every time that cycles back and forth, the capacitor builds a charge and then it pops, builds it, pops, builds it, blows the charge, builds it, blows the charge. And a capacitor can do that at the rate of thousands or now trillions of times a second. And that's how we tuned a radio. We tuned a radio to get it to be, 1,540,000 cycles a second. That's 1540 on our AM dial. Or, 89.9 megahertz, 89.9 million cycles per second. So a capacitor is like a dam that once a year builds its power, and then as it has enough water behind it, it lets it out at a certain rate so that it can power Las Vegas or New York City or hydroelectric power. The capacitor process of building the charge and releasing it is the same process that Uranus releases its energy, but instead of doing it regularly and often in an ongoing process, it's like sometimes the process is that the energy builds, it builds, it builds, it builds, it builds, it builds, it builds, and then kapow, the lightning strikes, and there's all kinds of change.
So
Now,
is that what we're going to see as Uranus and Saturn?
well, here's the thing, and I got this image from Rob Hand, and if somewhere buried in Planets in Transit, he talks about how um, with a Saturn Uranus aspect, what happens is that an irrepressible force, that would be Uranus, and once lightning starts, you can't stop it. An irrepressible force, Uranus, meets an immovable object, that would be the dam or Saturn. An irrepressible force meets an immovable object. Something's got to give.
Sure. So what do you do with that? Is that the call for, because it seems like if you try to force an immovable force, that's going to get real ugly real fast. Or do you adapt and maneuver around that force?
Well, and again, we come to fate is what happens to us, and free will is how we react, how we respond to that. And so we are in the midst of what an astrologer might call a perfect storm. We're coming off of this Saturn Pluto. I'm sorry, we're coming off of this Uranus Pluto square. And then we came to the Saturn Pluto conjunction, this time with Jupiter in it, and this time, for the first time in 500 years, in the sign of Capricorn. And now we're coming to the Saturn squaring Uranus, all within a very short period of time. This whole thing is within a decade. It's from 2012 to 2022. And so it's almost like there is a compressed amount of stuff going on, and we're not going to stop what's going on out there. But by how we respond to it, we can, in fact, alter the trajectory of the events and the trajectory of the river. And so, again, I have no specific advice. Some people are, heading for the hills and buying supplies, and other people are working in their neighborhoods trying to build more, community solidarity, so that when things, or if things kind of get more difficult, there's basically the community support that we in the United States, compared to many other countries, totally lack. And so I don't think there's I said this earlier, there's not a one size fits all that everyone can just, that I can say, just go out and do this. I would say, do the inner work. I would say that in some ways, this is about looking at the places that we each have individually, the Saturnine places of resistance, of constraint, of repression, of denial, all those Saturn, the false authorities, all of those energies exist in each and every one of us. But this dance between the old and the new, Saturn being the old, Uranus being the new, is something that's useful, it's productive, it's necessary, it's important. But it's important not to just look at the old and get so freaked out by it that we come in with weapons of if not mass destruction, weapons of destruction. I think Bucky Fuller said it as well as anyone, and that is, the way to make change is not by taking down the old, it's by creating the new.
Right.
And that's my paraphrase of him. So when Uranus and Saturn get together by conjunction, square, or opposition, and we can track this cycle back with great regularity. This particular cycle began at the conjunction in 88, 89, where we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, Tiananmen Square. Is it good or bad? That depends on what side of the fence you're on, and whether you're invested in the fence, or not. But there's a clash between the structure that's in control and in charge, the wall in Berlin, for example, or the Chinese Communist government in China, and how many people are willing in some way to create some substitute reality, so that and the results of those two events were very differently, because in China, although there was a bit of an opening, there also was a strong clamp down. In Germany, on the other hand, you saw a society that actually opened, I want to say gracefully. It wasn't, I mean, it was like, it was like not as gracefully as it might seem on the surface, but the fact of the matter is that the wall just disappeared. It was like no one even questioned it, so to speak. It just is just the wall just disappeared. So there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of resistance. I've been holding the position all year that COVID-19 is not the pandemic, that
Right.
COVID-19 is a symptom of the pandemic, and the pandemic is a pandemic of fear. And we come back to, the fear of the unknown, the fear of change, these big changes going on. Freud had this whole concept, actually all psychodynamic psychology does, and that is a concept called infantile regression, or infantile reminiscence. It's when things get crazy, we go back in our minds to a place that was better. Make America great again. It's this idea that if I could only go back to the simplicity and beauty of my childhood, that would make everything better now. But I forget that I had two alcoholic parents. My brother was abusing me. My blah blah blah. I mean, and
Sure.
somehow it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. That's lost in the shuffle. This idea that when we have, in particular, Saturn and Uranus rubbing up against each other, there's this need to find this balance between these two energies that appear to be out of balance. One of them is the freedom of expression, Uranus, and the other is the need to maintain stability and structure. And so we need to, if anything, just look at our own individual lives and begin to develop ways to manage the stress of what happens when unconstrained expression meets structure. And I would say certainly that we need to develop adaptability and flexibility, but I would say that to any fixed sign interaction,
Sure.
because that's what the antidote is.
Yeah, well, and it just seems like, practically, it just seems like trying to resist what's happening around, even in private lives or in public, either way, that just seems like a setup for a much bigger fight than maybe is necessary. Like, we have this time to be on pause and re strategize a bit about how we're going to be practice flexibility, um, to navigate this stuff,
Yeah.
especially, your one little voice taking on your world, whatever that may be, the family structure, the government, whatever that looks like. So to just do it at home seems like it might be a little bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, we can go back to 1783. There was there was a Saturn Uranus opposition. That was the U.S. Constitution. We can go back to, I'm just cherry picking a couple of things here. 1860 to 1863. There was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Saturn Uranus squares, and that was the time period of the American Civil War.
Sure.
You know, we can go back
99,
to
2000. Did you spot that one?
which one?
99, 2000 right there, but they were reversed at that time.
Well,
Right.
yeah, 99, 2000, actually, really 98 to 2001, because we're really looking at the World Trade Tower bombing, which really was very closely the Saturn Pluto opposition. But Uranus was in the picture during that whole time, in a square. So yes, that certainly is significant. We can go back to 1975, and although the Vietnam War had ended, the Vietnam War was the opposition of Saturn and Uranus in 63 to 68. And we had the civil rights movement, and we had the Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong in China, and the Vietnamese War, Vietnam War. But in the mid 70s, we had upwards to 3 million people were killed in Cambodia under Pol Pot and the, Khmer Rouge. That whole, I mean, there are some really glaring examples, of difficulties, but there are also examples of how those boundaries just suddenly disappeared and went
Sure.
down. I mean, again, the civil rights, movement in the United States, and arguably, one can say it didn't do as much as it looked like it did on paper. But we're back at that again. That's part of the undertone, or maybe the resounding note of this whole, period of time right now. Again, harkening back to the Civil War. Um,
Mhm.
but we have these things that are going on. Oh, we can look at the not in 1918, 1917 to 1921. Those was an opposition, and we had the Bolshevik, the Russian Revolution. We had women gaining the right to vote in the United States, and we had the end of World War One. The beginning of it was very closely tied to Saturn Pluto. And there's an example of the Saturn Pluto conjunction of 1914 began the war. And it was the Saturn Uranus opposition that ended the war. But we also saw the Spanish flu pandemic in that period of time. And there's very interesting literature that shows, or that arguably demonstrates, that what we call the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 was actually began in 1914 in North Dakota. It's a whole story there.
Sure.
But that would tie it to the Saturn Pluto conjunction very, very closely. At the opening square in the 1930s, where we had Saturn in Capricorn. Oh, that was Saturn in Capricorn and Uranus in Aries. So yeah, that was the opening. That was a closing square. Um, that was the period of the Great Depression, but it was also the period of the New Deal. So it's good news, bad news, or bad news, good news. The conflict, the tension, the stress is there. It may create events, but the lightning strikes, and out of that comes Roosevelt and the New Deal. And we also, of course, during that time in the 1930s, we had the formal establishment of the Third Reich. We had the rise of fascism, in that period of time in Russia, in Italy, in Germany, in Japan. And so, it's a mixed blessing. There was, the Saturn Uranus conjunction in May of 42. Certainly, although World War II was already flourishing, that was the height, or maybe the beginning of the Nazi, mass genocide. That
Mhm.
the whole Holocaust was actually tied to that, Saturn Uranus square, and then the or Saturn Uranus conjunction in 42, and then the square in 1951-52 could be tied to the Korean War. So we definitely see wars tied to these, harsh aspects between Saturn and Uranus, but we also see some good outcomes. We also see some good things. What's going to happen now? We've never had this opposition at this level with the mass social media that we have
Right.
now. And what does that mean? And how much of that will be um, suppressed by Saturn maybe pulling the strings and taking the Uranus freedom out of the internet and social media? Then we go back to street, playing telephone, with the cans and the strings stretched, rather than typing a message and having it read by everyone in the United States. I don't know how this is going to play out, but it's certainly not over.
Sure. Well, and I mean, I feel like, we look that it's Saturn in Aquarius, so he's pretty comfortable over there. Uranus is totally comfortable, and poor little Taurus is trapped in the middle of all of these comfortable energies. And then we're going to whack them against each other. And it's like, hey, we're not doing things the brick and mortar way, Taurus. Come with me, adjust. Let's adjust. So I feel like that really fixed earth material world energy just gets pushed on by the digital climate for sure.
Yeah.
And so we start to really figure out, and I mean, we can see the influence now. Education has never been this way for kids, where it's one, not only not optional to
Yeah.
be online in some capacity, you know, but also they're used to being out there running around mask free and doing all of these things. But I also think that too, that Saturn, wherever it goes, it gets pretty serious. So in the clash of the Titans as it comes along here, will also firm up digital things, social things, and hopefully for the better, like you're saying, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, again, one person's hope is another person's demise.
It's true.
Um,
Right?
and,
Hackers are going to be real pissed.
say that again.
I said hackers will be real pissed if we get real firm.
Well, yeah, I mean, it certainly goes beyond that, because in any binary argument, the extremes get greater and greater. And if there is an Uranian sudden resolution, that's not going to make the other side go away.
Yeah.
And so we have a tough road in front of us, or a tough row to hoe in front of us, regardless of what happens at this election, because the election is not going to make the divisiveness go away.
Yeah, it's out of the bag now. So now we really have to figure out what to do with it. Yeah. It's going to be a little bit of a stubborn year, I think. I don't think it's bad.
A little bit.
I mean, you know, fixed energy is just a little stubborn, Rick. Just a little. It's a lot. Okay. It's a lot stubborn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be something I'm going to be happy to be a part of, see how this whole thing plays out. At this point, I'm like, oh, hell, can we just bring in 2021? Because I'm so curious now. I'm like, let's just get to the other side of the election. Let's get past inauguration. Let's get into 2021 and really see, see what we've been waiting to see.
Well, and remember, Mars is virtually stationary on the election. I mean, it's a week away from going direct, but it's, and so that energy is all built up. Mercury, this is the first time that Mercury is stationed on election day since 2000. Remember 2000?
The Chads.
The hanging Chads, and now we have a situation that we've never had. And that is, at least going into the 2000 election, there was no reason to think that the election wouldn't be, done on that day. And now we have general agreement that the election will not be called on that day, just because of the massive amount of mail-in ballots, and B, because one of the two contestants has already said that Trump will declare that who's ever winning on election day, that'll be the result. That it will not, that the ballots will be contested because confidence on the entire system has been undermined. And so this is new territory. Again, it's new territory. Mercury having been retrograde for 3 weeks coming into the election, and although it turns direct on the morning of election day, it takes days for it to get speed up moving forward again. And Mars doesn't move forward until the following week, until 10 days later on the 13th. So yeah, this is going to be a very interesting, month and a half, or 2 or 3 or 4. And when we finally have clarity on what happened here by next January or so, then we still have yet to step into the first of the squares
Which is the
in
17th.
February. So
yeah, that's what I keep thinking about.
Definitely isn't over.
Not even a little bit. So, well, I look forward to seeing you before 2021, of course, but certainly on the other side. This is definitely a good time for astrologers in our little pattern tracking we're getting to see what's what. Our research friends, their eyes are this big right now.
Yeah.
Which is beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
thank
it's
you.
in times of crisis. That's when, that's what is it? Crisis is the mother of invention. We have to figure out how we're going to do things that we didn't need to before that.
Well, and circumstances make us real willing to change.
Well, I don't know that it makes us willing to change, but it makes us change.
Fair enough. As long as circumstance and change remain in that sentence, I think it's good.
I agree.
Man, thank you for coming over again. And the world of astrology is busy, so I appreciate you making time.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I'm just a little upset that I get invited to lunch and I leave hungry. So,
Well, that's the magic of hanging out on the internet. Absolutely. All right, you guys. Well, it's been a good talk. Hopefully you had some ideas, or you're spurred, or you're thought about something, or you have a view of 2021, which I think is really the most honest thing, is that we don't know. But we get to kind of watch and see it play out. But what we probably have more information on than anything is what's happening in our own little spheres and what we can do right there. So thanks again for coming over,
yeah,
Rick.
my
And
pleasure. Thank you. Let's do this again, but not tomorrow.
but not tomorrow. All right. Well, tomorrow we'll actually have Athen Chimenti coming over, and he's going to take us out of the realm that we're normally in over here, and he'll be talking about true sidereal astrology. So I will see you guys tomorrow morning. Bye, everybody.